Hello, my name is Jason MacKenzie and I'm conducting an interview with Michael Stephen on behalf of the British Turkish Cypriot community, both in the UK and in the Turkish Republic of Northern Cyprus. Now, Michael is an esteemed authority on the Cyprus issue, and he wrote a book entitled The Cyprus Question and supplied written evidence to the House of Commons in 2004, both of which are cited amongst the most authoritative evaluations of the Cyprus problem. Michael himself was a Harkness Fellow in International Law at Harvard, and he served as Assistant Legal Advisor to the UK delegation to the UN for the 25th General Assembly, which was 1971 to 1972. He was also a member of the UK Parliament between 1992 and 1997. So greetings, Michael. You are an authority. Everyone listening to this in the UK and in the Turkish Republic of Northern Cyprus will be very much looking forward to hearing what you have to say and your insights on this subject. First of all, Michael, you happened to cultivate your long-standing interest in Cyprus, and what was the sequence of events leading up to you being asked by President Denktash to be his advisor on international law?
There was a time when I was running the Bow Group's Foreign Affairs Committee. And the Bow Group is a Conservative Party think tank, which was founded by Sir Geoffrey Howe in the 1950s. We were looking at all the trouble spots on the British foreign policy scene. And one of them, of course, was Cyprus. So I asked two members of Parliament to write about Cyprus, one from the Turkish Cypriot point of view, the other from the Greek Cypriot point of view. Well, the Greek Cypriot point of view was delivered, but the MP writing the Turkish Cypriot point of view did not deliver. So I thought, well, I can't print just one side of the Cyprus story, so I'd have to do the research myself and look at it from the Turkish Cypriot point of view. I was really quite astonished what I found, because at that time, like most British people, I thought that Cyprus had been subjected to an unprovoked attack by Turkey, that the Greek Cypriots were the injured party, and that we ought to feel sorry for them. Well, I very soon discovered that the opposite was the case, that as far back as 1963, the Turkish Cypriots had been subjected to a violent attack, in fact, a genocidal attack upon them, just because they were Turkish. And at Christmas of 1963, very many Turkish Cypriot men, women, and children were slaughtered by the Greek Cypriot militia. And this went on into the early part of 1964 as well. It was because of that Cyprus is divided. In fact, at that time, in order to save themselves as best they could, the Turkish Cypriots withdrew into defended enclaves in Nicosia, Famagusta, and other places, and survived with a little bit of help from Turkey, but not very much.
Very interesting. Michael, one of the things that occurred to me when I first started looking at the Cyprus issue is that many of the accounts of the division of the island date back to 1974, but you've just mentioned 1963. Could you perhaps unpack why you've got a different starting point in terms of your chronology and your perspective on Cyprus?
Well, the chronology actually goes back a lot further than that. Cyprus is only 40 miles from the coast of Turkey and was inhabited by people from the Turkish mainland from time immemorial. It was actually part of the Turkish state for 300 years, until in 1878, Disraeli persuaded the Turkish government to hand it over to the British in recognition of the help that we'd given Turkey to keep the Russians out during the Crimean War. And so it's been British since 1878, right up until 1960, when Britain was getting rid of all its colonies. And we had to decide what to do about it. So we called a conference at Zurich and London. We got the Greeks, the Turks, the Turkish Cypriots, and the Greek Cypriots together. And we hammered out a deal, which they all accepted, where we would hand over power not to the Greek Cypriots, or to the Turkish Cypriots, but to both of them as partners in a new republic, each of them having sovereign rights and constitutional safeguards. And that was ostensibly accepted by all of them. But very, very soon after that, only a matter of months, Makarios, the leader of the Greek Cypriots, was saying, "Oh, no, this is the present, but this is not the future. This is not how we see Cyprus. We see Cyprus as a Greek island run by Greeks, or Greek Cypriots, and possibly even annexed to Greece itself." That was their vision, and it still is. And it's, of course, very much supported by the Greek Orthodox Church, who still dream of making Cyprus an entirely Greek island and possibly annexing it to Greece. And until they get that idea out of their head, there's no way that there's going to be a settlement in Cyprus that both the Turkish Cypriots and the Greek Cypriots can live with.
Michael, I'd like to just question this from the chronology bit to ambiguity. The island of Cyprus itself belonged to Turkey, and then Disraeli took possession of it effectively on behalf of the United Kingdom. And so when you wind the clock right back into history, you're saying that it was a Turkish island. Is that correct?
Yes, it was indeed, from 1571 to 1878.
And coming up to speed, as it were, 1960 was when the island was handed back effectively, but to a shared, a power sharing arrangement, if you will, between Greek Cypriots and Turkish Cypriots. Is that a fair?
Yeah, exactly. The 1960 constitution, which was agreed at the Zurich and London conferences, provided for a functional federation where the Greek Cypriots had certain powers, the Turkish Cypriots had certain powers. The president was to be a Greek Cypriot, the vice president was to be a Turkish Cypriot, and because the Turkish Cypriots were smaller in number, they were only about 1/3 of the population, slightly less. They had certain constitutional safeguards entrenched in order to protect their position. But within a couple of years after the British had handed over, Makarios, on behalf of the Greek Cypriots, tried to dismantle all those constitutional safeguards and to turn the Turkish Cypriots into a mere minority whom he could do as he pleased with. Well, the Turkish Cypriots at that time, led by Kachuk and Denktash, thought, well, we're not having this. We're going to take this to the Supreme Constitutional Court of Cyprus, which had one Greek Cypriot judge, one Turkish Cypriot judge, and a German judge as the president of the court. And this was to do with the law of the municipalities, which Makarios and the Greek Cypriots were refusing to implement. Well, Makarios said, well, if the court rules against us, we will ignore it. And the court did rule against them, and they did ignore it. And so the German president resigned, and the rule of law in Cyprus collapsed at that time, and that, I think, was November of 1963.
So I think that will come as a surprise to some of the people listening to this broadcast. I certainly had dated the conflict back to 1974 and not to a great many years before that. Clearly, the United Nations is a key stakeholder, and as we record this, we're in the lead up to another summit at which the Cyprus issue will be discussed and debated. But just to put that into context, when you were advising the UN, can I ask, how would you describe the UN's position when you were there? And also, how would you characterize how that has evolved, and where do you think it's at now?
Yeah, well, I was there in the early 70s before the 1974 events. And the United Nations had already become part of the problem in that it had recognized the Greek Cypriots as though they were the lawful government of Cyprus, even though they were not. The constitution of Cyprus provided for a joint government of Turkish Cypriots and Greek Cypriots. But by 1971, it was a totally Greek Cypriot government. And the Greek Cypriots say, oh, well, the Turkish Cypriots went away and vacated their positions. So we had to run the government ourselves. Well, that is absolute nonsense, because at Christmas of 1963, the Turkish Cypriots were subjected to a violent military attack, and many of their men, women, and children were killed in their beds. And the Turkish Cypriots had to withdraw into defended enclaves in order to survive. And the very idea that they'd somehow walked away from their positions in the state and left it to the Greek Cypriots is absolute nonsense.
So we're 50 plus years on now. It appears to have moved its position with regard to the EU. EU membership had been dangled before and used as a hollow incentive, if you like, for many years. And it seems clear to me that President Erdogan is keen to forge alliances with Islamic states and those who are sympathetic. So potentially you've got a very different position from Turkey toward the EU, which might shift some of the geopolitical plates. What do you think the EU at this particular inflection point should be doing, Michael?
Well, just like the UN, the EU has become part of the problem as well. In the early days, they took Greece in as a member. And then the Greek Cypriots wanted to get in. And there were some lawyers who said, well, no, this would be unlawful, because under the 1960 Treaty of Guarantee, to which Greece and the United Kingdom were parties, Cyprus could not join any economic or political union without the consent of all three guarantor powers, that is, Britain, Greece, and Turkey. And Turkey and the Turkish Cypriots were not willing to give that consent. The Turkish Cypriots wanted very much to go into the European Union, but not on the basis that Cyprus was represented entirely by Greek Cypriots. They wanted to have their constitutional position back as it should have been, and as it was agreed in 1960. And then, as a partnership state, they were very happy to go into the EU. Well, that didn't happen, and they were asked whether they wanted to agree to the Annan plan for reunification. That was Kofi Annan, Secretary General's plan. And the Turkish Cypriots had a referendum, and they agreed that they would accept the plan. The Greek Cypriots had a referendum, and they decided that they would not accept the plan. But nevertheless, the European Union took them in as a member. And from that day forward, the EU is not and cannot be an independent party, because it has two members, the Greek Cypriots and Greece on one side. Turkey is not a member. Turkish Cypriots are not a member. So I think going into these latest talks at Geneva is putting the Turkish Cypriots into a very dangerous position, because they have against them on the other side of the table the Greeks and the Greek Cypriots. And as we know, they have their own agenda, and that is to make the whole of Cyprus an entirely Greek island with no Turkish participation, and of course to get rid of the Turkish army. That's their objective. Britain is also there. Britain is not going to be supporting the Turkish Cypriots. Britain will be trying to maintain the status quo and won't say to the Turkish Cypriots, no, well, we can't agree to a two-state solution right from the outset. They will inveigle them deeper and deeper into more and more complicated proposals and suggestions. The whole object being to move the Turkish Cypriots away from the idea of a two-state solution and enmesh them in something rather like the Annan plan, which would have been a total disaster for the Turkish Cypriots if they had accepted it. Because by now, the Greek Cypriots would have used their undoubted political and legal skills and their financial resources to manipulate the institutions of the new republic in order to take the whole island over, and they would then have achieved their objective. So who else have we got there? You've got the UN. They're part of the problem. They were the ones who accepted the Greek Cypriots as the government of the whole island after they had thrown the Turkish Cypriots out of all their constitutional positions by force of arms. Instead of doing what the international community did in later years, for example with Kosovo, they didn't bomb the Greek Cypriots. They didn't even complain to the Greek Cypriots about their conduct. They just rewarded them by treating them at the United Nations as the government of Cyprus, and that has been the position to the present day. And because of that, all sorts of things have followed. For example, the inability of the British government to allow direct flights from London to Ercan stems from the fact that the Greek Cypriots are recognized as if they were the government of the whole island, when morally and legally they clearly are not.
So in the upcoming talks, the EU will be attending with observer status, as I understand it. Let me drill right to the heart of the question. Is it possible for recognition of the Turkish Republic of Northern Cyprus by individual nation states, i.e. outside of the UN parameters? Could countries around the world decide that because the TRNC is a de facto sovereign, democratic, independent nation state, is it possible that a government could recognize them and give them full diplomatic status and everything that comes with that?
Well, yes, that's possible, but the British won't, because the British are in a difficult position because we have military bases in Cyprus, and they happen to be on the main one. Actually, happens to be on the Greek Cypriot side. So the British government doesn't want to do anything which is going to upset the Greek Cypriots. They realize that their position is doing an injustice to the Turkish Cypriots. But in the great game of international politics, that really doesn't matter. What matters is the strategic interests in the Middle East and the usefulness of those bases, which are also used by the Americans. So you've got the Americans on the same side. And although they won't be in the room, of course, their influence is hugely important. So the British and the Americans would not agree to recognition. And when it was tried before, there were one or two states that did recognize. I think Bangladesh was one of them. But to force them to change their position. And I have no doubt at all that any state, unless it was a very powerful one, like China, decided to recognize the TRNC, then again the strong arm tactics would be used by the British and the Americans, supported, of course, this time by the European Union, to make them change their mind. So it's not easy. That there may be some countries in the Muslim world who would say, well, no, we've had enough of this. Our Muslim brothers and sisters are being very shabbily treated by the international institutions, and it's about time we took a stand, and we will recognize them. Now, if that happens, and there are maybe a dozen or so who do recognize the TRNC, then there will be a wholly different ballgame. It will no longer be possible for the Greek Cypriots to go around the world saying nobody other than Turkey recognized the TRNC. The TRNC will have become an actor on the international stage, and its voice will have to be heard.
So in light of that, what can the Turkish government do to lobby Muslim majority nations who may be sympathetic to the cause of the TRNC to recognize the TRNC as this independent, sovereign, nation state, which would potentially open up all manner of opportunities to it with the wider world?
Well, assuming the Turkish government wants to do that, I used to have my doubts, but it looks as though President Erdogan has now decided that this is the right thing to do, and that it's no longer viable to continue trying to cobble together some kind of federated state of Cyprus, and there's got to be a two-state solution, which I think is the right way forward. I think that's what he's beginning to think. He can then, of course, use diplomatic processes in order to persuade those governments to recognize. And Turkey, of course, is a major player. Turkey is no longer the sick man of Europe. Turkey is an important regional power. They have political influence. They have military influence. Are they willing to use their power to secure recognition for the TRNC, or are they not? I don't know.
Michael, may I ask, what do you view as the risks for the EU, the UK, and the wider international community if they continue to perpetuate their historic red lines on a solution for Cyprus, which in turn will further compound Turkish Cypriot isolation for the international community?
Well, the British government doesn't care about the Turkish Cypriots, nor does the American government. They might say they do, but actually they don't, because the great powers who have occupied Cyprus over all these years, going right back maybe 1,000 years, have never cared about the people who live in Cyprus. Cyprus to them is just a strategic asset, and so it is today. So what is the downside to the British government to continue the status quo? Well, not very much, really. It values its relations with Turkey, but I don't think it's ever been put in a position by Turkey where it thinks, hang on a minute, well, we've got something to lose by continuing with our present position. They've never been put in that position. The great game of international politics is never static. Relationships, power structures are always changing. And one day, the cards may fall on the table in such a way that it makes it in Britain's interests and the American interests to recognize the TRNC. But I don't think those cards are falling like that on the table at the moment. So I think the Turkish Cypriots and Turkey better be very careful when they go into this conference at Geneva to make sure they're not ensnared into another Annan Plan Mark II, which the Greek Cypriots will then exploit in the way that I fear.
I just wanted to pick up on one specific piece of granular detail. What is the relevance of the UK sovereign bases in Cyprus in terms of their implications for ongoing discussions?
Well, they're very important, and they're the main reason why Britain has been prepared to ignore its own legal obligations and to ignore fundamental human rights and injustice in relation to the Turkish Cypriots. Because to them, the ability to use those bases for their surveillance and military operations with the Americans in the Middle East is more important. And that's the position today. So I don't think the Turkish Cypriots have got anything gained by going into the Geneva conference. They will be going into a spider's web, and they will have all the forces ranged against them. The UN might say they're neutral, but they're not. The EU doesn't even pretend that it's neutral. Of course it isn't. And we know where the Greek Cypriots and Greece stands. And from the reasons that I mentioned just now, I don't think the British will be on the Turkish Cypriot side at all. Although, of course, they'll be trying to make out that they are. In reality, they won't be.
The Turkish ambassador to the UK has described the ongoing political isolation and the embargoes against the Turkish Cypriots as legally unsustainable. How should these now be challenged, and who do you think should drive the change? Is it the UN or is it some other transnational body?
You know, you can forget the UN. I mean, the UN is part of the problem. If the problem is going to be solved, it's going to be between Turkey, Britain, and America. As to whether the ambassador is right about the position being legally untenable, well, yes, it is legally untenable. The Greek Cypriots are not the government of all Cyprus, yet they are recognized as such. There is no state any longer since 1963 that you can really call the Republic of Cyprus. It's been divided since then into two political entities. It was unlawful for the Greek Cypriots to join the European Union. It was a breach of Britain's obligations to allow that to happen, because Britain could have vetoed that in the European Union. It was also a breach of Britain's obligations not to take action against the Greek Cypriots when they tried to overwhelm the Turkish Cypriots back in '63. It was left to Turkey as the only guarantor willing to take any action, who stepped in 1974 and rescued the Turkish Cypriots from what would have been total annihilation. So don't trust the British, don't trust the Americans, don't trust the United Nations, and certainly don't trust the European Union. In fact, there is nobody around that table that Turkey or the Turkish Cypriots could trust or place any reliance upon. I'm afraid they have to rely on their own resources, and I think they've got nothing to gain by going into this conference.
You clearly aren't overly optimistic about the opportunities for the TRNC at the upcoming conference, but of course they are committed to going, and President Tatar is no doubt going to make as forceful an argument as he can. If you had the opportunity to sit around the table with the British Foreign Secretary, Mr. Raab, for just a minute or so, and to make the case for why the UK should take a different stance and a different posture toward the TRNC, specifically with regard to direct flights, which of course are imperative and could provide a lifeblood for the TRNC, and also with regard to wider recognition of it as a sovereign independent nation. What is the potted argument, Michael? What would you say to Mr. Raab?
I mean, first of all, Dominic Raab is not making British foreign policy on this issue. I mean, he is the Foreign Secretary. But British policy on Cyprus has been devised and maintained by the mandarins of the Foreign Office, the senior civil servants of the Foreign Office, right back to 1960. They are in charge, not the politicians who come and go every 5 minutes. So, you know, this is serious British Foreign Office policy, backed up, of course, by the Ministry of Defence, and no Foreign Secretary for the time being or Defence Secretary for the time being is going to have very much influence on that, unless the Prime Minister, who, as we know, does have Turkish origins way back, unless the Prime Minister decides that enough is enough and the human rights of the Turkish Cypriots should no longer be violated. They should be allowed to trade and travel freely in the world, just like everybody else. And let me put this question to you: if the people of Scotland had voted in a referendum that they had a few years ago to leave the United Kingdom and set up as their own sovereign state, the consensus is that they would have been allowed to. And by now, Scotland would be an independent state, possibly even a member of the United Nations. So if the people of Scotland are allowed to have self-determination and set up their own state, why should the Turkish Cypriot decision to do so, way back in 1983, not be similarly recognized? Are they not entitled to self-determination as well? So all the legal arguments are in favor of the Turkish Cypriots, but the big political powers just ignore them.
So, Michael, it seems that there are various scenarios for the future of Cyprus. One, which is perhaps the most pessimistic possible outlook, is the continuation or the perpetuation of the status quo. Another possible option is that somehow there's a breakthrough in the talks and the Turkish Republic of Northern Cyprus becomes recognized as an independent, sovereign, democratic, self-governing nation state. How do you foresee the future, and what's the best case scenario as far as you're concerned?
Well, I think the important international players have the opportunity at this point in time to solve the Cyprus problem once and for all. And the way to do that is to recognize two separate states in Cyprus, the TRNC and the Greek Cypriot state. And by so doing, they would have removed forever the Greek Cypriot ambition to dominate the whole of Cyprus and throw the Turkish Cypriots out. Now, if that is no longer an option for them, why should they not deal with the Turkish Cypriots as sensible human beings? Why should they not trade with them? Why should they not live side by side, just as the Czechs and the Slovaks do today, who decided some years ago that they'd be better living in their own separate states? So I think that is the way to solve the Cyprus problem. I don't think the British and the Americans would do it because I don't think they've got the strength, the political strength. They don't have the leadership. Frankly, they don't have the guts to do it. And so what are we left with? We're left with the status quo. And that, to my mind, is much better for the Turkish Cypriots than being drawn into another Annan Plan type federation or confederation with the Greek Cypriots, where they will undoubtedly be the losers. If a two-state solution cannot be achieved, then the next best option for the Turkish Cypriots is to continue as they are, perhaps with Turkey trying to encourage other nations around the world to recognize the TRNC. The worst option for the Turkish Cypriots will be to allow themselves to be dragged at the Geneva talk into another Annan Plan type federation, confederation arrangement with the Greek Cypriots, because I have no confidence at all that any such federation or confederation would work today any better than it did in the 1960s. That was a dreadful disaster. There was a very bloody divorce between the Turkish Cypriots and the Greek Cypriots. And surely nobody wants to see that again.
Michael, Stephen, thank you so much for insight into the Cyprus issue. Thank you also for shedding light on it for those that have been viewing this. And thank you to you, the viewer, whether you're watching us in the United Kingdom or in the Turkish Republic of Northern Cyprus or indeed in Turkey or anywhere else in the world. Thank you for your interest in this issue. And I'm sure that we all agree that we want a good outcome, a good, democratic and fair outcome for the people of Northern Cyprus. Thank you so much for watching. And we wish you well in your endeavours to support your community.